Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me today. Make sure that you are following and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode. Share it with your family and friends. I've been speaking about the national strategy for a long time, so that's going to be the focus of this episode. But you want to share the P.A.S. Report podcast, including the America's Founding series, because it's a way to rediscover the United States, to recognize the forgotten patriots that played a role in this American experiment. And I'm so glad that there are many of you out there who are enjoying the America's Founding series, and I love doing these episodes. It's actually refreshing because it focuses on forgotten patriots who made America an exceptional nation, and it gets me away from the everyday Democrat and Republican battles that exist. But when we look at it, we still have to keep focus on the issues as well. We have to look at the issues that impact our lives and how far we have deviated from the Founding Fathers' vision, how everything they warned about is happening today. And that's why today we've got a breaking and critically important, I would say, episode that every American needs to hear, because towards the end of last week, the ODNI Director Tulsi Gabbard, she declassified one of the most disturbing and unreported documents in recent years. And this is the Strategic Implementation Plan for the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. And I want to begin by giving credit where it's due, because I want to give a big thank you to Julie Wright and George Hill, who flagged this for me. It shows why it's so important to pay attention to what's going on out there, to what's being released by the government, what's happening behind the scenes. Because the declassification of this document should be front page news. But of course, it's not. And the media has barely touched it. And let's be honest, not even conservative media outlets have really given the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism the attention it deserves. It's not giving the SIP that Tulsi Gabbard released the attention it deserves. And I've been on the national strategy since day one. I have been sounding the alarm bells since this document was first issued in June of 2021. And there's a few other people that spotlighted the dangers of this document. The great journalists like Miranda Devine, John Solomon, Tucker Carlson covered it, Glenn Beck, few others. But the national strategy still remains largely ignored, and that's a huge mistake. This document, it lays out in black and white a bureaucratic blueprint for turning the full power of the federal government on ordinary Americans under this pretense of combating domestic terrorism. From the beginning, I warned how this document could easily be abused, how dangerously vague and ripe it was for these abuses. And the strategy relies on undefined terms like anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, terms that you could apply to just about anyone who questions the government narrative, anyone that questions government mandates, anyone who supports traditional values or dares to dissent from the narratives. And thanks to the ODNI director, the newly declassified SIP is the operation manual, right? The standard operating procedures. It shows us just how this strategy was implemented. It directs federal agencies from the FBI and Department of Justice to the Department of Homeland Security, even Health and Human Services, even the Department of Education, to gather intelligence on Americans. That should be unacceptable. No agency should be able to gather intelligence on Americans when we are not doing anything wrong, when there isn't any allegations of a crime being committed. But it's not just about gathering intelligence on Americans. It's about the coercion of big tech, the coercion of our financial institutions. It's about training local law enforcement on extremist symbols and speech, but only symbols that they deem to be extreme or speech that they don't like, and even partner with mental health professionals to monitor what they call so-called threats. This isn't conspiracy theory. This really happened. And can continue to happen unless the American people stand up and say enough is enough. This is the government's own document. It's their own words. And in this episode, I'm going to walk you through how it was actually used and how dangerous it is. And what's even more alarming is how little resistance there has been to this. Little resistance from lawmakers that are entrusted to provide oversight over the bureaucracy. Lawmakers who claim to defend liberty, who claim that they're champions of constitutional rights and the Constitution itself. I understand for some lawmakers, they want the big government apparatus. But what really frustrates me, what really burns me up is the lawmakers, particularly Republican lawmakers, who go out there and they campaign on fiscal responsibility. They campaign on limited government. They campaign against the abuses of power. And yet once they're in power, they do nothing. They do nothing to stop it. In fact, many of them actually just vote to keep these programs going. Now, why hasn't Congress acted to repeal or defund the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism? Why hasn't this been debated on the House or Senate floor? Where is the oversight and where is the accountability? Not for nothing. This is not a partisan issue. This is not about Democrats or Republicans. To all you liberals out there or progressives, whatever you want to call yourself, understand how easy the script could be flipped under the Trump administration. And the Trump administration should have rescinded this document on day one. On day one, they should have rescinded the national strategy and said this is an aberration of what America stands for. And while some agencies like the ODNI may be changing policies to try and implement safeguards against abuse, the reality is the strategy along with the SIP remains in effect. And so in today's episode, I'm going to break down what's actually in the SIP. I'm going to show how it's already been used to target Catholics and parents, pro-life activists, political dissenters, expose how the system can be flipped on its head and used against the left under future administrations. And finally, I want to call on officials to publicly rebuke the national strategy, lay out what reforms must happen to dismantle this framework before it's too late, because the longer it stays in place, the likelihood of going away, it will become non-existent. So this is going to be a deep dive, but one that every American needs to hear, because once you understand this document, once you understand what's in the plan and how it's used, you're going to realize it's not about stopping terrorism. It has absolutely nothing to do with stopping terrorism. It's about stopping people. It's about stopping people by controlling speech, by controlling their behavior, even by controlling what we think. Now, I want to get back to the strategic implementation plan for the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, because when you understand the SIP and you understand the pillars of the national strategy, you'll realize that the SIP isn't just a wish list, okay? It assigns lead roles to agencies like the FBI, the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, the Directorate of National Intelligence, Health and Human Service, and just about every one of our government agencies. More importantly, it formalizes the role of the National Security Council in overseeing and reviewing implementation through the Counterterrorism Security Group for Domestic Violent Extremism. Now, that means that there is a permanent interagency structure that now exists that meets at least every 12 months, and they continue to provide updates to this strategy, even though they don't release those updates publicly. In other words, this is built for long-term use. This isn't like, okay, Biden's out of office, and so now the national strategy goes away. This document, the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, is going to be used regardless of which political party holds the White House. And what it does is it empowers the bureaucracy over the president. When we look at Pillar 1, which focuses on information sharing, they make it sound like it's harmless. Like, okay, agencies are just going to share information. That was one of the big failures that led to 9/11. Each agency had a piece of the puzzle, but they couldn't communicate with each other to put the pieces together to understand what was going on 9/11. But Pillar 1 of the national strategy goes well beyond just information sharing, because what it calls for is an aggressive expansion of domestic terrorism analysis, the capture, the wide net of capture of information that's out there. And here's where it gets dangerous. The SIP that Tulsi Gabbard released instructs agencies to gather information for what they deem is non-governmental experts, right? And we've seen how this plays out in real time. We look at the real-world example of the Southern Poverty Law Center. These are people that are outside of government. They are highly partisan. They are nothing more than a far-left organization that seeks to destroy those it disagrees with, that wants to slander their reputations. And we saw this with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. We saw it with other individuals, that they'll put the extremism label just because of someone going out there and saying that Islamic extremism is dangerous and represents a threat to the United States. So you see the real-world example of the Southern Poverty Law Center now becoming part of the intelligence community, where the FBI relies on them to get information. And we saw this play out in the Richmond product that targeted Catholics as domestic violent extremists, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But it also tells agencies to actively go out and look for anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. But when you read through the SIP, and again, it's like 15 pages. I encourage everyone out there, read it on your own. You do not have to take my word for it. These are documents you could read by yourself. And when you read through it, you're going to see it's just as vague as the national strategy was. It doesn't provide a definition or clarification as to what is considered anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. What qualifies as anti-authority? What if I criticize the FBI? Is that anti-authority? What if I question the public health mandates that come down the pike? What if I support things like school choice and I go against the public schools? Am I being anti-authority? Am I sounding like an anti-government conspiracy theorist? And so I'll start off with the FBI's Richmond memo. I might as well talk about that since I brought it up. And you see, go to Pillar 1, subsection 1, and you'll see it clearly. So pillars, and I have it laid out on the website, so you can check out PASreport.com to see it all there. Because I reference these documents. I tell you where to look. So if we look at the FBI's Richmond product that targeted Catholics, it includes pillars 1.1, 1.2, and 4.1. The FBI's Richmond field office labeled traditional Catholics as domestic violent extremists, as the potential. What was their crime? What crime have traditional Catholics committed to get that label? Well, according to the FBI's intelligence analysis, Catholics may want to attend a Latin Mass. Oh my goodness, a Latin Mass, how dangerous. Catholics may oppose things like abortion, because Catholics haven't been pro-life for decades upon decades upon decades. But what's even worse is that Catholics have the audacity to believe in two genders. And again, this memo, it didn't have any real intelligence analysis. It was all based on information from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And this is where we see the national strategy and the SIP combining. I don't understand why it's no outrage about targeting Catholics, calling for the infiltration of churches, when no crime has been committed, no act of terror organized through any Catholic groups, through any type of church. And now we're going to say that Catholics represent a threat to our society. It's a gross violation of the First Amendment. It violates our free speech. It violates the freedom of religion. It violates the right to assemble under a church, in a church, where we want to exercise our faith. And it also ties in directly to Pillar 4 of the national strategy, because Pillar 4 aims to confront long-term contributors, and that's their words, not mine, to domestic terrorism. But understand, the long-term contributors that they list is nothing more than code for traditional religious and moral and cultural values. That's the long-term contributors that they say fuels domestic terrorism. So if you're someone that has traditional beliefs, if you value your religion, if you talk about morality, if you talk about cultural issues, if you hold centrist to conservative policy positions, well, it may be Catholics that they wanted to initially target, but they could cast a much wider net than just Catholics under the national strategy. And it's not just Catholics. It's also about political opposition, because we know that in 2023, 2024, you had FBI whistleblowers reveal that the FBI created a MAGA threat tag in order to attract Trump supporters, despite no predicate for criminal activity. You know, the only political crimes I saw take place were 2 assassination attempts on, at that point, the former president of the United States and a presidential candidate. Yet they were saying that MAGA was the threat. So you look at the MAGA threat tag and then take a look at Pillar 1, which authorizes the expansion of analytical production and categorization of how threats and the trends of threats are captured. And now, based on political affiliation, based on who you, the American people, may support in any type of presidential campaign, you could be caught up because of the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism and the Strategic Implementation Plan. If you look at Pillar 2, Pillar 2 encourages sharing information with tech companies about online activity. And think about what it means when you look at posts that criticize the government in any way. Remember, the national strategy links domestic terrorism to the quote-unquote supply and demand of information online. And so who do you think wants to control the supply of information online? Who do you think wants to lead that effort? And it's obviously government. And we saw how the government bullied social media companies, and the weak-kneed, feckless social media companies dutifully complied with what the government was trying to do. They didn't really push back all that hard. And part of the problem is the revolving door. You know, officials that left the FBI, that left CIA or NSA, they retired from their positions and they went on to go and work for the Twitters or the Facebooks or the LinkedIns. Now, if we stick with Pillar 2, we look at their prevention. They want to prevent mobilization to violence. And this pillar now moves from analysis to pre-crime prediction. And it instructs agencies to work with frontline individuals like educators or mental health professionals, nonprofit organizations, even family members. So the SIP tells federal agencies create threat management teams and engage in upstream prevention before any crime has actually occurred. Now, what does that mean? Threat management teams. What are these threat management teams going to do? Well, they're going to try and reach out to the frontline people before any crime has actually been committed. And we started to see this build out during the pandemic, where neighbors and family members were encouraged to rat each other out if someone wasn't complying with the draconian decrees. Now, that's more reminiscent of a Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a Kim Jong-un's North Korea, a Fidel Castro's Cuba. That's what that's reminiscent of. And they want to import that here to the United States. Pit neighbor against neighbor, family member against family member. Make everyone suspect that if they hold certain political beliefs, well, that person may be a domestic terrorist. You look at how parents were targeted at school board meetings. Pillars 1, 2, 3, and 4. When parents push back against school closures, radical curricula based on a political agenda, not really education or learning, you had the National School Boards Association work with the White House, create the Department of Justice memo comparing parents to domestic terrorists. Some were even going so far as saying that parents should be investigated under the Patriot Act, because they represented an existential threat to the United States. And just days later, after the National School Board's letter comes out, the DOJ and FBI actually mobilized. They mobilized joint terrorism task forces throughout the country, clear use of Pillars 1.2, 2.1, and they directed the federal government to engage in local threat assessment teams, monitor potential threats like parents. Now, normally, if someone threatens a local school board official, that is a local crime. Okay, you're not allowed to threaten people. It's already illegal to do that. And the local PDs can handle that. You don't need to get the FBI in that. But that wasn't the case here, because the SIP even referenced tools for local law enforcement to identify mobilization of violence and then inform the FBI. In this case, what did that mean? Well, it meant parents speaking out passionately about what their children were learning in school. It meant if parents had the audacity to elevate their voice ever so slightly at the school board, well, then that person can get flagged. There's a bigger picture going on. I want to provide more examples of how this framework is used to criminalize normal political activities, to demonize. And destroy ordinary Americans, forcing them to self-censor, forcing them into the groupthink mentality. And it's all under the guise of domestic terrorism. We're looking at how these abuses have been perpetrated on the American people and how if this document is not rescinded, the abuses will only get worse. It doesn't matter who is in office. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or Democrat in office. It doesn't matter if it's Trump in office. Understand the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism empowers a bureaucracy. And then presidents can use it as they see fit. And if we look at, we just focused a lot on pillars 1 and 2. Let's look at pillar 3, where it talks about disrupting and deterring domestic terrorism, because this pillar focuses on investigation, prosecution, and enforcement action. And it's not being used to disrupt real terrorism plots. Let's understand that. It's not being used to disrupt terrorist organizations. It's being used to punish Americans for their beliefs. And again, if we want to look at it, all we have to do is look at the actions of law enforcement agencies. Look at the FBI raid on pro-life activist Mark Huck. He was a Catholic father of 7. He was arrested at gunpoint by the FBI for allegedly shoving someone outside an abortion clinic. Now, the case was already dismissed locally, but they basically sent FBI SWAT to go after this guy, scare him and his family, as if he was like the next Osama bin Laden. And the Department of Justice charged him under the P.A.S. Act. The raid was no doubt politically motivated. And if you look at Pillars 3.1, it explicitly empowers law enforcement to use the federal resources available to pursue these types of cases, even in incidents that don't meet any reasonable threshold for terrorism. And Pillar 4 seeks to confront the contributors to terrorism. So if you are opposed to abortion, if you are opposed to traditional gender roles, well, you are a contributor to terrorism. Understand how that works. You look at CISA under the Department of Homeland Security and the censorship industrial complex. Again, we see all the pillars coming together here. And we learned a lot with the Twitter files release, right? When Elon Musk took over Twitter, rebranded it to X, and started releasing the Twitter files, we really learned the extent of federal coordination that exists with big tech. We learned about the extraordinary extent to silence Americans who dared to ask questions about lockdowns, about mask mandates, vaccine mandates, who dared to ask questions about an election. And these big tech companies, they did the government's bidding for them. You look at CISA, Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI, and they constantly sent takedown requests to the big tech companies for posts that they were flagging. Here you have the government bureaucrats sitting in offices, monitoring people, ordinary Americans, social media posts, flagging those posts for information they didn't like. But you also had the government coordinate with universities. And I think that this is even more dangerous, where the government was providing millions upon millions of dollars to universities so that the universities would play a role in labeling speech as misinformation. They funded projects like the Stanford Integrity Project that was done at Stanford University. And it was nothing more than an operation that was done by DHS. It was disguised as it was just Stanford University doing the Election Integrity Project. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security was running that operation. It had nothing to do with really Stanford. They provided tens of millions of dollars. I wrote about this before. Tens of millions of taxpayer dollars to go to universities so that universities could develop tools to target the American people, to target information that the government deems as misinformation or disinformation, despite the government being the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation in our history. So we used our tax dollars to silence our own voices. And that should infuriate every single American. You know, we should have learned our lesson with the, I forget what it was called, but basically our universities were building out a program to capture all the metadata that exists on every single American, every single person around the world. Now, this was a Department of Defense program where they were working with the universities to develop these tools. The Department of Defense scrapped the program, but the National Security Agency picked this program up and they rebranded it as PRISM. This is the one that Edward Snowden released. The PRISM program was capturing all electronic data. And you think that after that was revealed that we would have learned our lesson, but no, God forbid. Instead, we see these efforts expanded under Pillar 2 of the national strategy, which promotes this idea of public-private collaboration to remove what they deem as radicalizing content, even if it's constitutionally protected speech, even if it's just simple political disagreements. You know, for so long in this country, there was the pro-life groups and the pro-choice groups. And those were rational, normal political positions, and they would debate each other. But now, if you're pro-life, you see how the left rebranded language. Well, now you're against women's reproductive rights. They changed the terminology. And so now pro-life people are considered extremist. I would argue, what's more extremist? People that celebrate life and want to see babies born, or people that will literally push almost infanticide, abortion up until the moment of birth. And in former Governor Ralph Northam's case, he said even after death it's possible. But see, the national strategy is a political document. Understand, it's a political document that pushes a political agenda. And what people don't realize is that when you have a federal bureaucracy, a federal workforce, where 84 or 86% of all the campaign contributions go to Democrats, it kind of tells you who's running the bureaucracy, does it not? We see it every day. I mean, just to give you another example, we talk about iconography and phraseology. This SIP includes identifying icons and phrases that may be considered domestic violent extremists. And what gets included in that? Well, remember when the Betsy Ross flag was included in that. Remember when the Betsy Ross flag was seen as a right-wing extremist symbol? Look at what they did to Pete Hegseth. Look at how they tried to label the Secretary of Defense as a white supremacist, all because he dared to have the Jerusalem cross tattooed on him. Now, the Jerusalem cross itself has been a part of Christian iconography for more than a millennium. It's a symbol of sacrifice of Christ. It's a symbol of his message, the gospel message of love. And now they want to brand it as white supremacy. See where it goes? Christian nationalism, the new phrase they're using. You look at Pillar 4, confront long-term contributors to domestic terrorism, and it's the most ideological part of the plan. It goes after what the government considers the root causes of domestic extremism, opposition to gun control. You're a potential domestic violent extremist if you oppose gun control. If you have a belief in the Second Amendment, that the Second Amendment is absolute, that it states exactly what it means, well, then you may be a domestic violent extremist. If you oppose abortion, traditional gender roles, if you display any mistrust of government or the media, the state-sponsored media, well, then you're a candidate to be labeled as a domestic violent extremist. It even calls for what they deem as action civics. Now, this isn't your regular civic education. Action civics is not like national service, volunteering in your communities. It's not voting or anything like that. Action civics has nothing to do with terrorism. It's everything to do with indoctrinating Americans, indoctrinating citizens into progressive orthodoxy. And we see this idea of action civics played out in our classrooms. That's why students can't tell you who we fought in the American Revolution. Students don't understand the three branches of government or who has the power to do what. Students have never been assigned to read the Constitution, and I know I'm generalizing, but we see it. We see it in the proficiency levels. We see that most Americans can't pass a basic citizenship exam. We see it all the time. Now, action civics is code for social justice. But remember, the left gets to dictate what social justice really is. And that's where it shows that it's a political agenda. So this is all about a bunch of ideologically corrupt people within the bureaucracy trying to push political viewpoints under the guise of combating terrorism. Pillar 1 encourages analytical products around this idea of radicalization. Pillar 2 pushes prevention partnerships with even mental health professionals. Pillar 4 is where the ideology becomes clear. That's where we see the government overreach take place as a threat. The heart of the national strategy is nothing more than pushing a political agenda. And this national strategy is a political document that endangers everything our founding fathers warned against. It's whatever the people in power want it to be. They use it as a canvas, and they could use it any way they see fit. We've looked at the structure, the vague language, the agency coordination. We looked at how the framework has already been used to target ordinary Americans. At this point, I want to zoom out a little bit because I think it's important that everyone understands this is bigger than just former President Joe Biden, even though Joe Biden and his administration were the ones that issued this document in June of 2021. This is bigger than Donald Trump. It's bigger than left versus right. This is about liberty versus authoritarianism. That's what it comes down to at its very core. This is a constitutional issue, not a partisan one, because the strategic implementation plan and the broader national strategy for countering domestic terrorism creates the permanent surveillance and censorship architecture. And one administration can use it to target pro-lifers and Catholics, parents, Trump supporters. Well, guess what? The next administration could easily flip the switch, and they could use it to target climate activists, Marxists, sanctuary city advocates. All it takes is a shift in political power because the tools are already built in. That's why everyone, no matter what party you come from, everyone should be sounding the alarm bells. And the same bureaucrats that will tell you this strategy, well, it's just meant to protect you. Understand, it can and will be used against you as they see fit. Remember, 2 weeks to slow the spread. It's just meant to protect you. We need to keep children out of schools. It's meant to protect grandma and grandpa. You wear your mask to keep me safe. Meant to protect you because I wear my mask to keep you safe. Understand that they use that word protect intentionally. But all it does is empower the bureaucracy, not the people, the bureaucracy. And if you oppose the ruling ideology, you're going to find yourself labeled as a threat. You're going to be flagged. Your social media posts may get flagged, or you may even be put on a watch list for simply exercising your First Amendment rights. Just think how Tulsi Gabbard was placed on a watch list. And I want you to really think about that. A high-profile former congresswoman was placed on a watch list because she dared to raise questions. She dared to push back against Democrat narratives. And ironically, she is a Democrat. She's not a hardcore conservative. She is not a Republican. She is extremely liberal on a lot of issues. Some will say that she's progressive on a lot of issues, but they don't care. They target her because she spoke out. Thankfully, she's releasing this document, shows us exactly how they target. And this is exactly the kind of power that the Founding Fathers warned us about. It's why we have a Bill of Rights, and it's why we need to act now before this bureaucracy becomes completely untouchable with the national strategy. So here's what needs to happen. President Trump, and you know, listen, there's a lot of things that I like that what he's doing. But there are areas where I'm going to criticize him. There are areas where I'm going to push back against his administration. I spoke to former retired supervisory intel analyst George Hill last week, and we criticized the FBI and the lack of reforms at the FBI. You know, Director Kash Patel and Deputy Director Bongino, they know what's wrong with the FBI. They know the abuses that have taken place. They don't have to sit there and wait to correct those things. They need to start implementing reforms now. And people are like, oh, you got to be patient. You just got to wait. No, why should we have to wait? Why? The national strategy should have been rescinded on day one. That should have been the first executive order signed. President Trump, and this is what needs to happen now, President Trump must immediately rescind this strategic implementation plan that was released by ODNI Director Tulsi Gabbard, and he needs to rescind the entire national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. I'll write them a new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism that protects the right of the people, that protects our civil liberties, that protects our constitutional rights, and at the same time actually does target terrorism. I'll write it for you. If Trump is serious about draining the swamp, this has to be a priority. But it's not just about Trump. Congress has to step up themselves, and they have to legislate. Executive action only goes so far. We need laws passed to defund these programs, to dismantle the framework, and prohibit federal agencies from using such vague ideological definitions to classify as American threats. We need a piece of legislation that's crafted and passed that states, if you are going to use the term anti-government sentiment or anti-authority sentiment, you need to lay out specifically what that means. Every American should be able to see what the government defines that as, rather than just throwing those words out there where the slightest criticism could be deemed as anti-government or anti-authority. So Congress has to do its job. They're the ones with the power of oversight. And I'll remind Congress how this could easily be weaponized to target members of Congress themselves. Don't forget, it was Democrats, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who routinely label Republicans in Congress as white supremacists. Are they national security threats? Are they domestic violent extremists? Okay, so Republicans in Congress better wake up. They better start actually living by what they preach. When they campaign on limited government, when they campaign on stopping abuses of power, it's not enough for just words. We want to see actions once you're in office. And it doesn't just stop with the president or Congress. It's up to you, the everyday American people. You have to stay informed and speak out. Don't just go by what you hear on the news. Don't even go by what you hear from me. Read the national strategy yourself. It's 31 pages. It is not a long document. It is a quick read, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Read the strategic implementation plan that was just released. It's 15 pages. And again, you don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need to be a political scientist. You don't need to be a government expert to see what's wrong with both the national strategy and the SIP. Read it. Share it. Expose what they're trying to do behind the scenes. This is nothing more than a communist Chinese-style surveillance system that's being built out here in the United States. But it only works if we, the people, stay silent. But we're not going to be silent at the P.A.S. Report podcast. We're going to keep the conversation going. I am going to keep talking about this document as I have for the last 4 years, or going on 4 years. It'll be the 4-year anniversary, June of 2025. But keep the conversation going. Share this episode with your family and friends. Most people have no idea that the national strategy even exists. They don't know what the strategic implementation plan is. Share it. All right. Leave the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating. Write a quick review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, wherever you listen, because it really helps more people be able to discover the show. Subscribe to the P.A.S. Report podcast. We can reverse this. But the window on the national strategy is closing. If we don't demand accountability and transparency now, this is going to become the new normal. And I despise the phrase, the new normal. I truly despise it, but it will be the new normal. Remember, this isn't the bureaucracy's country. It's ours. We the people. Never forget that. Now, I want to thank you for joining me today. You're a fantastic audience, and I appreciate everything you do to make the P.A.S. Report a successful podcast. And don't forget, tune in tomorrow for another great episode of the America's Founding series on the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you haven't listened, trust me, you will not be disappointed. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back tomorrow with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.